In this episode of FullDroopTV, we fabricate a bed cage and install bypass shocks on Project F-150, then get Project Silverado's fenders into paint. FullDroopTV starts now. This episode of FullDroopTV is brought to you in part by Swayaway.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of FullDroopTV. Well, today we're going to be building the bed cage on our F-150 so our rear suspension matches the travel numbers we have up front. Now, we've already got our Deaver long travel leaf springs installed, but the factory shocks are what are limiting the amount of travel that we can get out of the rear. You can see it's just a physically shorter shock, so it's going to be the stopping point for us. Now, building our bed cage is going to raise the upper shock mount location so that we can fit these 16-inch Swayaway 3-tube bypass shocks. Now, the reason why we chose a bypass shock instead of a conventional shock is these valves here will allow us to tune the shock once we get some testing time in. So we're going to start with our lower shock mount.
We picked up these tabs from Tab Zone that we're going to be using for our lower shock mount. And I've bolted in the shock misalignment spacers as well as a couple washers to hold the correct gap between the tabs so when I weld it, it won't distort and bring the tabs in. With our lower shock tabs in place, we can determine the line of our Swayaway 3-tube bypass shocks. And we can tell by looking at this that we're going to be running into this area here, which is the upper mount for the old shocks. So what we're going to do is cut this off with our plasma cutter to make extra room, and then I'm going to cut a plate that's going to go over the frame and over the hole from cutting this off. I've cut out this plate to go over this section of the frame where we cut the old shock mount off. Putting this plate up here and welding it in will add a bunch of strength to this section of the frame. To run our shocks up through the bed, we're first going to have to cut a hole. Now, every truck and every bed is a little bit different, so my suggestion would be to start small. You want to mark a smaller hole first, cut that area out, and then work from there out until you get the correct diameter. That way you don't cut a huge hole in the bed. Now, every bed cage is going to be different. The shock mount's in a different location. The shock mount on the axle might be pushed back. It all depends on what type of shock, what diameter shock, and the angle that you're running it. So with this, we're going to start with this area here. I'm going to drill a couple holes and get this cut out. The bed of our F-150 has two mounting bolts that go down into the frame. We're going to use these two bolt locations for the base of our bed cage. So what I did is I cut this piece of 1 3/4 120 wall tube and capped the end and drilled it. Then I'm going to take the factory bed bolt, slide it in place, and bolt it in. Then with this plate, I'm going to slide it into place, and that's going to serve as the base structure for our bed cage. With that tacked in place, I can remove these two bolts, take this piece over to the welding bench, then we'll fabricate the entire structure. I'm going to be creating an upright that comes off of this base to hold the top part of our shock and create a mounting point for it. Instead of just welding that directly to this bottom plate, we wanted to box this lower structure to create a firm foundation for that upright to mount to. So I've bent up a couple pieces that are going to sit in here like this. And this top plate will go up on top and cap all that off. This will provide us a nice, firm foundation for that shock upright. I'm using some magnets to hold the shock in place so I can make my templates for the upright portion of our bed cage. I've also cut out these pieces of 1 3/4 tube, capped them and drilled them to provide me with the bolt location for the top of the bed cage. This is a poster board template that I cut out, and this is actually going to be one side of the upright. There'll be one here and one on the inside as well. I'll get these transferred onto some sheet steel and cut out. We're using our 12-ton shop press in conjunction with our Pacific Customs dimple dies to create some flared holes in this piece. We've got one side of our upright tacked in place. This is the other side, and as you can see, I had to put a break in the top section. The reason I did that is I want to be able to run the bolt straight through the shock. And since the upright is on an angle, this corrects that pitch so we can run the bolt straight through. Once I get this tacked in place, we're going to run a 2-inch tube on the back side to keep everything square. Then I can unbolt the shock and remove the upright so I can take it back over to the welding bench to add the boxing plates. I've tacked in the back boxing plate. This piece that I cut out is going to go in the front, and that's going to add strength to the entire upright. Once I get these tacked in place, I've cut out a template that's going to go up here on top to box in the top part of our upright. Now that is going to have a relief cut in it so the shock fits in. With our upright bolted in place, we don't have enough support for the shocks using just these 2 factory bolts. So we're going to add a third mounting location back in this corner of the bed. Just like you see here, I ran a piece of 2-inch 120 wall tube and bent it over to a mount that I created that welds into the frame underneath. Now to create that mount, the first place I have to start is by cutting the 2-inch hole in the bed. I've cut and capped a piece of 2-inch 120 wall tubing and drilled it for a 5/8 bolt. That's going to go in this location here. Now to tie it into the frame, I'm going to notch a piece of tubing that's going to go from this point over to the frame and weld in.
We're here at Worldwide Auto Body, and they're going to be spraying our Fiberworks bedsides and fenders for us for our Project Silverado. But before we get them in the spray booth, they had to do a little prepping on them. Now they started the process using 3M 180 grit sandpaper on a longboard to make sure everything was smooth and flat. Once that was completed, they took Pro Spray primer, primed all the fenders and bedsides. Once that was dry, they moved on to wet sanding. Now for the wet sanding process, they took 3M 400 grit sandpaper, did that once over all the panels, then they moved on to a 600 grit sandpaper, then an 800 grit sandpaper. Now once all that was done, they scuffed them up, cleaned them up. Now it's time to get them in the booth.
Worldwide Auto Body owner Ricardo Calderon used the paint coat on our Silverado to mix up his Pro Spray paint and lay down 2 perfect coats of color. After the first coat of color dried, Worldwide Auto Body wet sanded our fenders and bedsides before spraying on the second coat of paint. They finished up the process by laying down 4 coats of clear.
The final two tubes of our bed cage are going to tie the uprights together. There's going to be one tube that runs from the bottom along the bed over to here, and another tube that runs from the top of the upright over to the other side. I put a couple slight bends on either end of the upper crossover tube just to keep it in line with the lower tube, which we kept straight. Once I get this lower tube tacked in place, we're going to unbolt the bed cage, take it over to the welding table, and finish all the welds.
We clamp the rear mounts of the bed cage to the welding table to help prevent any distortion while finished welding. There are a few more spots to finish welding, and the bed cage is ready to go back in our F-150.
FDTV Talk is presented by Prerunner Maniac.
Welcome to FDTV Talk, where we answer your questions on air. And today's question comes from Mike, and he asks,
I was just wondering, with all of the action cams on the market, which one would you recommend for off-road use?
That's a great question, Mike. And with so many action cams on the market right now, it's hard to make sure you're getting the right one for your application. Now, for us here at FullDroopTV, we like the Addiction Cam by JVC. You can see it's got a built-in LCD display so you can see what you're shooting. It's got built-in Wi-Fi so you can get a free Android app or iOS phone app and remotely control your camera and view it from a distance away. Now, another term that JVC created was called quad-proof. And what's that mean to you? That means it's waterproof up to 5 meters deep. It's shock-proof, so it can sustain a drop from up to 2 meters high. It's dust-proof and freeze-proof, so this is the perfect camera for off-road use. It's also very versatile in the way it mounts, with locations on the bottom and the side. And on our next couple episodes, we're going to put these cameras to the test. We're going to show you just how we mount them on our Prerunner and also share some footage that we get from using these cameras. So I hope that answers your question, Mike. If you have any questions about these Addiction cameras, visit FullDroopTV.com. And remember, if you've got a question that you want answered on air, visit FullDroopTV.com and click on the FDTV Talk icon. And remember, we've only got a couple more episodes to go, so get your question in today. Fabrication's complete on our bed cage, and we've got our sway-away 3-tube bypass shocks all mounted in place. Now, when we were designing this bed cage, we had 3 key features that were a must-have in it. It had to be bolt-in so that we could send it off to powder coat at a later date. We had to maximize the amount of bed space we have, so we tucked everything as close to the bed rails as possible. And the third thing, it had to have a consistent theme with the rest of the fabrication that we did. You saw this flat plate and flared holes that we used here was the same that we did on our rear bumper as well as our front bumper. Now, in our next episode, we're going to head to the desert to get a little tuning time done on these bypass shocks that we got from Sway-Away. So remember, if you have any questions or want more information about the products that we use in this episode, visit FullDroopTV.com. So until next time, we'll see you in the dirt. Another episode of Full... Yep.
Bends on the end of our top tube that, I don't know what I'm saying.
So we can bolt it out, bolt it out, bolt it out.
Bolt it out.
Vroom, vroom.